At my brother's promotion ceremony, he grabbed the microphone from the podium and grinned at the crowd. "I want to thank the person who made Halloran and Sons what it is today," he said, voice warm with practiced confidence. He paused, eyes sweeping the room full of investors, family friends, long-time employees. Myself. Everyone laughed. Dad laughed loudest. I stood at the back of the conference room holding a manila folder against my chest, smiling. Not because it was funny, because I already knew what was in that folder, and I knew exactly when I was going to hand it to my father. Let me tell you about growing up as the wrong kind of smart. My brother Colton has always been the kind of person rooms rearrange themselves for. He walks in, and somehow the best chair is suddenly available. The funniest story belongs to him. The loudest laugh follows him around like a loyal dog. I used to wonder if he practiced it, that effortless magnetism. But I think some people are just born with a gravitational pull and the rest of us spend our lives trying not to get sucked in. I'm Nora. I'm 34. For the last 6 years, I've been the Chief Operating Officer of Halloran and Sons, the custom millwork and commercial cabinetry company my grandfather built from a single workshop in Dayton, Ohio in 1971. We fabricate built-ins, architectural woodwork, high-end cabinetry for hotels, hospitals, corporate offices. It's not glamorous work to explain at parties, but it's the kind of company that shows up in the bones of buildings people will use for 50 years. I love it for that reason. Colton is the VP of Business Development. His job, as he has always defined it to anyone who will listen, is to bring in the vision. My job, as I have always defined it to no one because no one asks, is to make sure the vision doesn't bankrupt us. Our father, Robert, is 67 years old and has been planning his retirement since approximately the moment each of us were born. He wanted sons. He got 1 son and 1 daughter. He made peace with this by deciding that Colton would run the company and I would support Colton. This was never discussed. It was simply understood the way weather is understood. I want to be clear about something because I've told pieces of this story to 2 friends and a therapist over the past year, and every single time I get to this part, people want to jump ahead to the revenge. I understand, but you have to understand the full weight of what I'm carrying into that conference room or none of it makes sense. I started working at Halloran and Sons at 22, right out of Ohio State because Dad asked me to help out for a summer, and summer turned into a decade. I did the operations analysis that saved us $340,000 in vendor contracts in 2019. I restructured our project management system after we nearly missed delivery on a $2.1 million hospital installation in Cleveland. I negotiated our current manufacturing lease, which is $8,000 a month below market rate, because I spent 3 months building a relationship with the property management company before I ever asked for a concession. I know every employee by name. I know their kids' names. I know which foreman gets migraines when the humidity changes and needs to be moved off the floor. Colton knows our top 3 clients by their golf handicaps. This is not me being bitter. This is me giving you the facts. The promotion ceremony was Dad's idea. He called it that, a ceremony, which tells you everything about how my father experiences the world. He rented out the private event room at the Charter House downtown, invited 43 people, ordered a catered lunch with a carving station, and had a plaque made that read, "Colton Halloran, President and CEO, Halloran and Sons. Leadership through Vision." I found out about the event from my cousin Viv, who texted me a photo of her invitation 3 weeks before the date. I had not received one yet. When I asked Dad about it, he said he'd meant to tell me that it was just a formality, that of course I'd be there, and could I maybe help coordinate with the caterer because his assistant was swamped. I coordinated with the caterer. I also helped write the program, designed the seating chart, confirmed the AV setup, handled the parking validation arrangement with the garage 2 blocks over. On the day of the event, I arrived an hour early to make sure the temperature in the room was right because Colton gets a rash when he's too warm, and my father would have blamed me if Colton was uncomfortable at his own ceremony. I wore a navy blazer and my good earrings. I'd gotten a blowout the night before. I wanted to look like I belonged there. which is a feeling I have spent my entire adult life chasing in that company and never quite catching. Colton arrived 12 minutes late, kissed me on the cheek and said, "You look tired, Nor." I smiled. "You've got a poppy seed in your teeth," I said. He didn't. But he spent 4 minutes in the men's room checking, and that was the most satisfying 4 minutes of the entire morning. The part that broke something open in me didn't happen at the ceremony. It happened 6 weeks before on a Tuesday afternoon in late October. I was working through a contract review for a new project in Cincinnati, a boutique hotel renovation, significant scope, significant dollars, when I got an email that wasn't meant for me. It happens. Someone at the client's development company had CC'd our main office address instead of Colton's direct line, and it routed to me because I managed the general inbox. It was a chain, 6 emails deep, between Colton and a man named Derek Walsh at a private equity firm called Meridian Capital Partners out of Columbus. I want to be precise about what I read because precision matters here. In the chain, Colton had been in discussions with Meridian Capital for 11 months. 11 months. He had shared our financials, our actual P&L statements, our client roster, our manufacturing capacity data, without a non-disclosure agreement in place and without board approval, which in our operating agreement requires a supermajority vote of shareholders, of which there are 3, my father, Colton, and me. He had represented to Meridian that he had authority to negotiate a partial acquisition of Halloran and Sons. He was proposing to sell a 40% equity stake to Meridian Capital for $3.8 million, with himself retaining operational control under a new governance structure that would, in effect, reduce my father to a ceremonial role and eliminate my position entirely. The email I was looking at was Derek Walsh asking Colton to confirm the closing timeline so Meridian could allocate the funds before their fiscal year end. Colton's reply, sent from his phone at 11:47 p.m. 2 nights before, confirmed by Deck 15. Ceremony is Deck 2. After that, Dad signs whatever I put in front of him. I read that sentence 4 times. Then I closed my laptop, went to the bathroom, ran cold water over my wrists, and stared at myself in the mirror for a long moment. Here's what I did not do. I did not cry. I did not cry. I did not cry. I did not forward the email to my father or reply to the chain or do anything impulsive. I went back to my desk, copied the entire chain to my personal email, and finished the Cincinnati contract review. Some people, when they find out the house is on fire, start screaming. I start looking for the exits. Over the next 6 weeks, I did 3 things quietly. First, I called a business attorney in Columbus, not the firm we use for Halloran and Sons, a different one, and I had a 90-minute consultation about our operating agreement, minority shareholder rights, and what Colton's actions constituted under Ohio business law. The answer, delivered in careful legalese that I had to translate 3 times, was a lot. Breach of fiduciary duty, unauthorized disclosure of proprietary financial information, potentially tortious interference with the company's governance structure. Second, I pulled every financial record I had access to, which, as COO, was all of them, and built a clear, documented picture of what I had contributed to the company over 6 years versus what Colton had. Revenue generated versus revenue attributed. Operational savings. Client retention rates on accounts I managed versus accounts he nominally owned. I put it in a binder. A real physical binder, because my father is 67 years old and does not trust anything that exists only on a screen. Third, I requested a meeting with Derek Walsh at Meridian Capital, representing myself as a shareholder of Halloran and Sons, who had become aware of the discussions and had some questions about the process. He agreed to meet. I think he assumed I was going to facilitate things. We had coffee at a place near his office in Columbus. He was polished, the way people who work in private equity are polished, like a surface that reflects you back at yourself without giving anything away. He explained the opportunity. I asked careful questions. At the end of the meeting, I thanked him for his time and told him I wanted to be transparent. I had not consented to this process as a required shareholder, and any agreement reached without my signature would be legally void under our operating agreement. I showed him the relevant clause on my phone. He was quiet for a long moment. "Does your brother know you're here?" he asked. "Not yet," I said. I drove home in silence. I did not feel triumphant. I felt the way you feel after a long illness finally breaks. Not good exactly, but clear, steady, like myself again after a long time of not being. The ceremony was on a Wednesday. The Charterhouse event room smells like carpet cleaner and old wood, which I actually find comforting. I'd arrived early, as I said. I'd handled everything. When Colton gave his speech, I stood near the windows and watched my father's face. Dad was sitting at the head table, beaming. He'd worn his good suit, the charcoal one he saves for funerals and celebrations. He looked old to me in a way he hadn't before. Or maybe I was just seeing him clearly. Colton talked for 11 minutes. He thanked Dad for building the company, thanked the employees for their hard work, thanked the clients for their trust. He did not thank me. He mentioned me once in passing as my sister Nora who keeps the trains running. And there was a polite smattering of applause, and then he moved on. I kept smiling. After the speeches, during the lunch service, I made my way to my father's table. Our Aunt Rosemary was there, and a couple of long-time clients, and my cousin Viv, who caught my eye and gave me a look that said she'd heard the speech and thought it was exactly the kind of thing Colton would say. I sat down next to Dad. He put his hand on mine and squeezed. "Good event, Nor," he said. "You always make everything run smooth." "I need to show you something," I said, "when you have a moment." He must have heard something in my voice, because he looked at me, really looked at me for the first time that afternoon. He excused himself from the conversation he was in with the client on his left. I handed him the folder. It was organized. I'd learned that from years of presenting to him. My father doesn't respond to emotion. He responds to paper. He responds to lines and numbers and documentation. So I had given him lines and numbers and documentation. The email chain was on top, printed clearly, with the key passages highlighted in yellow. Behind it, the operating agreement with the shareholder approval clause flagged. Behind that, my operational contribution summary. Behind that, a letter from my attorney outlining the legal exposure the company faced if the Meridian deal proceeded as Colton had structured it. He read slowly. He's always read slowly. He watched his face and I did not say anything. Aunt Rosemary leaned over after a moment and asked if everything was all right. "Give us a minute, Rosie," my father said, in a voice I hadn't heard since I was 17 and had taken the car without asking. He finished. He set the folder down. He looked at the table. "How long have you known?" he asked. 6 weeks, I said. "Why didn't you come to me right away?" I thought about how to answer that. I thought about 26 years of the right chair always going to Colton, of my contributions being summarized as keeping the trains running, of being handed the catering logistics for my brother's promotion ceremony. "Because I needed to understand it fully first," I said. "And because I needed you to see it for yourself." He didn't say anything for a while. Across the room, Colton was working the crowd, glass of sparkling water in hand, laughing at something a client said. "He was going to eliminate your position," my father said. It wasn't a question. "Yes." Another silence. "The Cincinnati project," he said. "That was you." "The last 4 Cincinnati projects were me, Dad." He closed the folder. His jaw worked. "He is not a man who shows emotion easily, my father. He comes from a generation that considered visible feeling a kind of weakness, and he has spent his life perfecting the performance of being unmoved. But something moved in him then, sitting at that table in the Charterhouse with the sound of a carving station and 43 people celebrating the wrong child. He said, 'I'll need to talk to our attorney.' 'I've already spoken to one,' I said. 'I can connect you.' He nodded once, slowly. Then he picked up the folder, set it in his lap, and folded his hands on the table. "Go get yourself some lunch," he said. "You look like you haven't eaten. That was as close to "I'm sorry" as my father knows how to get. I knew that. I accepted it, because some translations are imperfect and the meaning still lands. I did not go back to my seat. I went to the restroom and stood there for a few minutes, breathing. Then I went to the carving station and got a plate of roast beef and a dinner roll, because I actually hadn't eaten, and I stood near the window and ate it quietly while the ceremony dissolved around me. I watched the moment it reached Colton. My father crossed the room with the folder in his hand and put a hand on Colton's shoulder and said something low and direct, and I watched my brother's face change. That easy, practiced confidence, the magnetism, the gravitational pull, it just went out, like a light switched off. He looked at me across the room. I was still holding my plate. I didn't smile. I didn't do anything, actually. I just looked back at him, and then I looked away and finished my lunch. People started to notice something was off. Conversations trailed. My cousin Viv appeared at my elbow with a look on her face that was half alarm, half the specific hunger of someone who knows something is happening but doesn't know what. "What did you do?" she whispered. "Nothing I wasn't already owed," I said. The formal fallout took weeks, and it was messy and painful in the way that family business disputes always are, which is to say, it was also a family dispute, with all the grief and fury and revisionist history that entails. My father retained outside counsel. Our operating agreement held. The Meridian deal was terminated. Derek Walsh, it turned out, had no interest in closing a transaction that carried legal exposure, and once Colton couldn't guarantee clean signatures, the deal collapsed. Colton retained an attorney of his own, and for about 3 weeks there were letters exchanged and a lot of phone calls I wasn't part of. In the end, Colton resigned from Halloran and Sons. He didn't fight for the equity. I think he knew by then that fighting would mean all of this becoming public record, and Colton has always prioritized his image over everything else. He negotiated a buyout of his shares over 3 years. He moved to Phoenix 6 months later. Our mother, who has always moved through our family like a diplomat in a conflict she refuses to name, told me at Christmas that he was doing well, keeping busy. I nodded and passed the sweet potatoes. My father offered me the CEO position in January, in a short meeting in his office where he slid a piece of paper across the desk with my new title and compensation on it and said, "This is what you should have had a long time ago." I looked at the paper. The number was right, the title was right. I thought about all the years it represented, all the 6 a.m. mornings and the vendor calls and the contracts and the humidity-sensitive foreman and the parking garage negotiation, all the weight of keeping something running that was never fully mine. "I need a week to think about it," I said. He blinked. I don't think he expected that. "Take what you need," he said. I took the week. I talked to my therapist. I talked to Viv, who told me to take the job because I'd already done it for 6 years and I deserved the credit. I went for long walks in the cold and thought about what I actually wanted, which is a question I had spent so long not asking myself that the answer didn't come easy. I took the job. Not because my father offered it to me, and not because Colton was gone, and not because I felt I had no choice. I took it because I built something real inside that company, in the bones of it, the way our millwork is in the bones of buildings, and I wanted to stay in it and keep building. I wanted to do it with my name on the door. Halloran and Sons is mine now, in every way that counts. We closed the Cincinnati hotel in March. We broke ground on a new client in Indianapolis in the spring. I hired a junior operations manager and told her on her first day, ask questions when you don't understand something. There's no such thing as a stupid operational question. There are only expensive surprises. She nodded like she understood. I think she did. I still think about that conference room sometimes. The carving station smell, the plaque with Colton's name on it, my father laughing at the joke about vision. I think about the folder sitting in my lap for 3 weeks before the ceremony and how I kept second-guessing myself. Kept wondering if I was reading the emails wrong, if there was a version of events where this was a misunderstanding, if I was somehow the problem for finding it at all. I wasn't. I knew I wasn't, but it took a long time to trust that knowing. Here's the thing about being the one who keeps the trains running. Everyone relies on you and no one thinks about you. You become part of the infrastructure. Necessary, invisible, taken for granted the way electricity is taken for granted, noticed only when it goes out. I stopped being willing to be invisible. That's the whole story. That's all it was. I've thought a lot about what I would have done differently. It's a question I kept returning to in the months after the ceremony. After the attorneys finished their letters and Colton packed his things and my father slid that piece of paper across his desk with my name and my new title on it. Would I have spoken up sooner? Would I have confronted Colton directly, given him a chance to undo what he'd set in motion? I don't know. I genuinely don't know. But I think there's a version of me, the version that existed 2 years before all of this, who would have tried exactly that. Who would have gone to her brother first, quietly, and given him the grace of a private correction. And I think he would have used that grace to cover his tracks faster. That's the thing about people who treat you like infrastructure. They don't expect the infrastructure to notice. Colton had spent so many years watching me absorb the invisible work, take the back seat, coordinate the caterers at my own professional erasure, that I think he genuinely stopped factoring me in as a variable. I had become, in his mind, part of the building. And buildings don't push back, but I had been paying attention the whole time. That's what no one saw. The quiet ones always are. What I learned, slowly, in ways that cost me, is that integrity is not the same thing as passivity. I spent years believing that doing the right work, consistently and without complaint, would eventually speak for itself. And maybe in a fair world it would. But the world isn't structured around fairness, it's structured around narrative. Colton understood that. He was always building a story about himself, out loud, in every room he entered. I was building a company. I thought the company would speak for me. It didn't. Not until I picked up that folder and decided to speak for myself. There's a version of this story where I'm bitter about the years. Some days I visit that version. 6 years is a long time to carry something without credit. But I try to come back to what's actually true, which is this. Every operational decision I made during those 6 years was real. The $340,000 in saved vendor contracts was real. The lease negotiation was real. The relationships I built with the foreman and the clients and the project managers, those were real. Colton could take the credit in speeches, but he couldn't take the competence. And in the end, competence is the only thing that holds. What Colton did, negotiating away 40% of a company he didn't fully own to people who had no idea the governance structure required my signature, wasn't just greed. It was the specific kind of arrogance that grows in people who have never once been made to reckon with their own limitations. My father built that in him slowly, with every assumption and every deference and every ceremony held in his honor. That's not an excuse. It's a cause, and causes have consequences. I don't feel sorry for Colton. I don't feel triumphant either, not exactly. What I feel, most days, is something quieter. Something like, I know who I am. I know what I built. I know what I took. And now my name is on the door. That's enough. That's more than enough.